Welcome to Lead for Good, a podcast for nonprofit leaders of all titles and all experience levels. This is a show where the audience will meet and get to know top nonprofit leaders. Together, we will take a deep dive into nonprofit leadership, endeavoring to uncover and unpack the most important characteristics, traits, strategies, and actions of successful nonprofit leaders. Through this journey together, we desire to help you, the nonprofit leader, grow your knowledge and capabilities to lead for good. We want you to achieve your full potential as leaders in the sector. So, welcome to the conversation. We're glad you joined us today. Without further delay, let's join our host, Chris Looney, as he interviews yet another extraordinary leader who is truly leading for good. Enjoy the show.
Welcome to Lead for Good, a show for nonprofit leaders of all levels, especially those that want to level up their knowledge and skills to reach their full potential as nonprofit leaders. My name is Chris Looney, and I have the good fortune to be your host for this deep dive into nonprofit leadership. And today on Lead for Good, I'm joined by Dr. Chad Nelsen, the dynamic CEO of the Surfrider Foundation, one of the most influential environmental nonprofits in the country, dedicated to the protection and enjoyment of our world's oceans, waves, and beaches. Under Chad's leadership, Surfrider has experienced a remarkable transformation, growing from a $5 million organization with a staff of 30 to a $15 million powerhouse with over 85 team members, while strengthening its grassroots chapter network, policy influence, and national impact. And in this conversation, we're going to explore what it takes to scale a mission-driven organization effectively and responsibly, from strategic alignment and culture building to capacity investments, leadership shifts, and infrastructure development. Whew, that's a lot. So if you're a nonprofit leader seeking to grow without losing your soul, which is totally awesome to put into context of the Surfrider Foundation, this is going to be the conversation for you. Looking forward to this informative session. So let's jump in, and welcome to the show, Chad. Thank you for joining us.
Chris, thanks so much for having me. I'm looking forward to this. We made a lot of mistakes along the way, which I'm happy to share, and hopefully this conversation can help others avoid them.
Yeah, well, I know it's tempting not to admit that any of us have ever made a mistake, but it's real, and it's a part of the leadership journey that we all make mistakes, and that's how we grow, and that's how we build stronger muscle in this area. And speaking of that, I'd love for you to share with our audience how you became the leader you are today. What does your journey look like?
Yeah, I think my journey is probably not that uncommon in the nonprofit world, which, sort of, I've been at Surfrider, if you include being a grad student intern, for 30 years.
Goodness.
So vast majority of my career here, I'm like a mailroom to the CEO type story.
Okay.
I, really wanted to get into conservation and ocean conservation. I went to grad school and became sort of a science and policy expert. So I was for 16 years here at Surfrider, working in our policy shop, running our policy shop. So I was one of those people that was just sort of out there, like doing the conservation work at Surfrider, and was part of a team that really helped this organization grow, which we'll talk about. And then about 11 years ago, I got hired as the CEO. I've been through, I think, four other CEOs during my tenure as a staff member here. Um, and I think I'm the first CEO that was hired from within.
Okay, interesting.
Which I look forward to telling you about that too.
Yeah, I'm excited to learn more because you obviously learned a lot about your leadership from those individuals, but also picked up a lot along the way separately. And that's amazing that you went from that mailroom to CEO. You might be one of the first interviews that we've done that's had that sort of internal journey, which is wonderful. I love to see organizations that build talent from within. So thanks for sharing that. But I'd be very interested to hear about some of the real positive and important influences on your nonprofit journey along the way. Who were those people? How did they help you?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked this question because I have been a big fan of mentors and seeking mentors throughout my whole career. Um, when I was after undergrad, I was working at the USGS doing geology for the federal government and really wanted to break into conservation. And one of my dad's friends who worked at an environmental organization kind of took me under his wing, and he was one of my first mentors, and he gave me some good advice. Which seems so straightforward, but at the time was profound. Two things he said. One is think 5 years ahead and where you want to be and work backwards, which as a 23-year-old, I was not doing. Uh,
What?
the other he said was, um, go look at this was pre-LinkedIn, so it wasn't so easy, but he said, go look at the resumes of the people, the jobs you want, and see what they did to get there and then go do that. And so that sent me to grad school. And he also recommended the Duke Nicholas School for the Environment, where I got my master's in environmental management. So he had a profound impact on my career trajectory. When I got to the Surfrider Foundation, there were like leaders in the coastal zone management movement. This is coastal commission leader types. I was going to professional conferences and listening to people speak, and I would say, "Oh, I like that guy. He's inspiring. He's knowledgeable." And I would go to seek to befriend those people and
Yeah.
never really asked them formally to be a mentor, just kind of like, interacted with them, followed them. And then at once I took over the leadership of Surfrider, um, I've had a number of board members who
Mhm.
were private executives in the private field who have had different skill sets. Some were like P&L numbers guys and financial guys that I really needed help there, so I sought them out. Others were more psychological leadership and what it means to be a leader. And so I have kind of, looked for people throughout my life to be mentors and great relationships and profoundly impactful in my sort of journey.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I love the idea of the sort of continuing education throughout a person's career, coming from individuals who possess extraordinary talent in a particular arena. And it sounds like you've been able to plug into those experts and take advantage of what they've been able to share and offer. And part of what I want everyone to know is the importance of having these resources, professional resources, people, textbooks, whatever it might be, to hone skills, to develop strengths in particular areas, and surround yourself with experts. So, thanks for
And
sharing.
I would add sort of one other thought to that. One,
Please.
in some cases, there was a specific skill or area of expertise that I knew I needed to improve upon, like the finance stuff. And I found a guy who was like a CPA. His name's Aaron Bailey. He runs a eyeglass eyewear company called Salt Optics. So in that case, I knew I needed like his help. He was on our board. And really help kind of organize our financials, which we needed when I got hired. And in other cases, I've just found super dynamic leaders, and I didn't know what I wanted to learn from them per se, but I was like, I want to be more like them generally. So I think you could kind of go either way in terms of seeking these mentors.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great. And you've been honing and developing your own leadership philosophy for many years now. And I'd be interested to kind of understand what's important to you in your nonprofit leadership style or philosophy. How would you describe it? What would you share that's tremendously important to you as a leader?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would add to that. I thought when I was the environmental director at Surfrider that I was a good leader and that stepping into this job would be easy. Um, and it was much harder than I thought it was going to be. I'd been at Surfrider for 16, almost 20 years at that point, and so it definitely when I moved over to become the CEO, uh, I had to up my leadership game, and the skills that I had running a small department were definitely different than being sort of the big boss. They talk about being a somewhat lonely job, and there's some truth to that. But like so anyway, that I definitely it was there was a couple years where it was a big evolution, and that's a time when like mentors were particularly important. People had already kind of crossed that Rubicon.
Right.
Uh, but yeah, some of the leadership qualities that I look for, I I'm one of the things that I think these are like to me lifelong journeys is I'm really trying to give people I'm trying to be hands off as possible. So I'm trying to give people the space and freedom and resources to succeed under me. And that's been a real shift. I want to be available but hands off.
Mhm.
So I'm not a micromanaging leader. And that there's been some challenges along the way as we've grown because not everybody can handle that.
Right. Of course.
And I really seek to lead by example. So I'm trying to sort of model the behaviors that I want the organization to exhibit. Um, and I think that I see my role as being partly about really trying to set the vision and be the visionary for Surfrider and be looking out ahead. And I have a really strong CEO that's helping me be operational.
Nice.
So we've been sort of able to divide up the tasks in that way too. That's been super helpful.
Yeah.
And I grew up in Southern California. I'm a beach kid. I'm a surfer. I'm an ocean user. I've got a marine science background. So I'm also trying to be an embodiment of the mission.
Nice.
Whether that's talking about conservation, getting out and using the ocean, and trying to be sort of inspirational in that I'm trying to like live the mission, so to speak.
Right. Right. So you're not going to be, drinking out of a plastic bottle while we're interviewing this podcast, right? So I
Yeah, that's right. And still try to
the
get out in the
Surfrider
ocean.
camping. Yeah. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, it's I think all four of those things that you mentioned are so tremendously important, and I love the fact that you were talking about being the visionary leader and thinking ahead, and it traces back probably to that early conversation when you're 23 and that individual tells you to think 5 years ahead, right? Which you are in many ways continually thinking 5 years ahead and are in the midst of a 5 year major initiative to raise huge dollars to accomplish all kinds of extraordinary things that Surfrider wants to participate in, right?
Yep, that's right.
That's good. That's good. Well, and that's part of the scalability story that we want to talk about today. So thank you for helping us really unlock some of the secrets to growth and how to manage that successfully because there's a lot of horror stories about growth that the organization couldn't accommodate and kind of sunk the ship. And then there's other organizations like yours that seems to be able to more successfully scale.
Yep.
And that means greater impact, which is the most exciting and important concept that we have here. Scaling is important because it increases the impact that you and Surfrider Foundation can have. So to begin, can you take us back to those early days of your tenure? What was Surfrider like when you took the reins? What were those big challenges back in the day?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, Surfrider's gone through some pretty, like, I think, typical phases of a nonprofit. When I actually was an intern in 1995, so 30 years ago, we were a five-person organization. The budget was less than $1 million. It was well-intentioned. Probably its reputation exceeded its capacity, which is a nice problem to have,
Right.
um, but pretty immature. I think during my tenure as the environmental director, through a series of really good CEOs that preceded me, we professionalized the organization, budgets, planning, org charts, all the things that kind of, and so we went into like a professionalization phase and we grew quite a bit during that. When I took over 11 years ago, we were actually in a rough spot.
Hmm.
The organization was in decline financially.
Interesting.
And I would argue that we never really made adjustments post 2008, 2009 financial crisis.
Right. Yeah.
And and so when I took over, we had burned through our reserves. We had let people go. So we were sort of in a shrinking phase. Um, my board expected miracles from me out of the gate.
Sure.
And so we sort of had to push off the bottom, turn things around, and then we started to grow very rapidly. And I had a couple board members that were super instrumental in helping me kind of figure that out and communicate to the board this is a turnaround.
Yeah.
Um, and so, what I did at that initial phase is we actually sort of reorganized the organization. I actually had an outside consultant that the board actually kind of forced me to use, but ended up being an incredible gift. Uh,
Good.
it came from a place of distrust because they didn't think that this like environmental scientists could solve their problems. But it was a gift to me because I had someone to work with and bounce ideas off of with fresh eyes. Um, consultings are a mixed bag, but some of them are fantastic, and this was that case. We
Indeed.
did a reorganization plan, and we built this pretty simple what I think of as the like fundraising flywheel, which was we were gonna really double down on impact of the organization. So we spent a bunch of time trying to figure out how to articulate our impact. Um, important. So that was like I think can be challenging for some. It's easier for some nonprofits than others. We're a policy-based organization, so it made it a little tougher. But we
Okay.
came out with a victory metric to talk about policy wins. Then we built a communications team, which was basically new to communicate those wins.
Yep.
Because we weren't, if a tree falls in the forest, we weren't doing a good job of talking about our impact.
Right. Right.
And, by talking about our impact, we were able to start raising more money because people want to pay for impact. And that money would go into capacity. And that capacity would create more impact, more communications, more money. And that became the virtuous cycle that, and if you think about it, it was almost our org chart. Mission, team, impact. Marketing, comms team, communicating the impact. Fundraising team, raising money off those great stories. Operations, building capacity and adding more staff. And in so some ways that relatively simple strategy, easier to say than to do because that required changing out staff, building a marketing team when we had no money. But it worked, and that sent us on a pretty, we pushed off the bottom, so to speak, and all of a sudden, we had more than 6 weeks of cash in the bank to survive. It was terrifying. And we've grown the organization, almost tripled it in size, and have a year of reserves at the bank now.
It's amazing. Now, was that intentional growth strategy from the beginning, or were you just trying to survive
And
in the beginning? How did you
I would
approach?
I would break it in, I would basically break it in half of so for like 5 years, it was the first 2 or 3 years were just like turning things around. And I have one more like I also had like one of the luckiest things happen to me, but which I'll tell you about, but was turning it around. And then all of a sudden we're like, hey, we're growing. And at first we were like kind of almost like startled and gun shy about the growth. Wow, this is amazing. We just raised more money than we spent last year. Like we put some in the bank and build some capacity and let's keep going. And about 5 years, probably the first 2.5 years were just the turnaround.
Yeah.
5 years into it, we're like, all right, seems to be like a trend, not a blip. And that's when we took a pause. Um, this was right before COVID and said, okay, we're growing. Let's start getting intentional about that. We built a new strategic plan. I think this is a question you're going to ask me. We made a bunch of investments in our infrastructure.
Okay.
Uh, we hired a fundraising firm to help us kind of with that next phase of growth. So we did take a pause and start to think more intentionally about growth. And I talk a lot about we went from a scarcity mindset to an abundance mindset at the organization, and that was also a pretty big shift.
Mhm.
Easier for some than others to adjust.
Yeah. So with an organization like Surfrider, does the funding cycle track some huge wins that you've had in sort of the advocacy work or policy change, um, or cleanups, or like is it tied to that, or is it just the ability to build year after year, sort of off that strong foundation and gather more members and more advocates and supporters?
Yeah, there weren't any home runs. We had home run victories. We took a Clean Water Act case in Hawaii to the Supreme Court and won. It was called the Clean Water Act case of the century. Um, and this was a 5-4 conservative court, and we still got the outcome we wanted. And you would think something like that would like result in like outpouring of funds, but our experience is it hasn't. It validated our organization as one that's impactful.
Okay.
But to me, it's really been sort of this steady, like, hey, this is an organization that's having an impact. We're grassroots based. We have a lot of local, state, and federal wins, and we're scaling those wins. And so it was really blocking and tackling and kind of building pretty steadily. There weren't any giant windfalls. Um, so which also helped us avoid kind of that you know, giant windfall and then a decline.
Falling off a cliff or over the falls, to use
Yeah.
right? Well, that's interesting. And I'd be interested to kind of know how you are able to really separate yourself from other organizations that are in the environmental space, or even in working in the ocean or with water, clean water specifically. Like how do you make yourself distinct? Because I think that's a challenge for a lot of organizations in the sea of sameness. That's a
Yes.
great pun, by the way. Um, how do you separate yourself? How do you make yourself distinct and something people want to support?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things that are almost inherent in the sort of design and mission of the organization. The first is we have this grassroots network. So we have 200 chapters and clubs in almost every coastal state and community in the country. Um, and so we have this kind of like ground up local activism base that does
Yeah,
programmatic work and advocacy.
very
It's,
unique. Yeah.
Sierra Club's got it, at which we were modeled after in the 90s, but not on coastal and ocean issues, kind of on more broadly environmental issues. And so we're sort of unique in the ocean conservation world, certainly in the United States, and in that. So we have that that's sort of unique. We invest a lot of our resources in supporting that network, whereas other organizations in the ocean conservation world might spend that on science, politics, lobbying, more sort of policy oriented work, all of which is important. And as a result, we're very complementary. Hey, we need the grassroots. Hey, we need presence in DC. We can work together. So that's one. The other is that Surfrider's mission is the protection and enjoyment of the world's ocean waves and beaches. So we're not only a conservation group, we're a recreation group.
Okay.
And that idea of representing people, real people who get out in the ocean regularly,
Yeah, and we're
whether it's
talking about
swimming
fishing,
or
swimming.
fishing, diving. Uh, there's a whole category of nonprofits that we also interface with, which are just outdoor recreation groups the Access Fund, which represents climbers, or International Mountain Biking Association represents mountain bikers. So there's like a outdoor recreation world and a conservation world, and we straddle that. So
Yeah.
that's somewhat unique also.
Yeah. And this
Certainly in the ocean conservation space, it's unique. Most other ocean conservation groups aren't as intimately tied to the ocean as we are.
okay. That's good to know. That's really good to know. I love that. And as you were trying to kind of align growth with the mission, I believe that it would have been very easy to have mission drift. And when you're scaling, sort of losing your core identity. How did you, as an organization, figure out a way to grow, yet stay on mission and stay focused on the kind of core priorities that you've always probably had since the founding?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's one advantage of having come from within the organization. And so, we work on five issues: beach access, clean water, plastic pollution, sort of climate issues on the coast, and ocean protection. And that's already a lot. And so, I also think you could argue that many of the most successful organizations are single issue organizations. So I'm a believer that the more focused you are, the better off you're going to achieve your mission. Um, so five's already a lot, and so we didn't want to expand beyond that. And you know, like any nonprofit, you're always exposed to funders and opportunities that want to take you off of those things. And, as they say, don't build a gym when you need a library. Um, we, we, uh, so we've been really stuck to that. We've been like, hey, we're gonna stick to our guns and stick to those issues. Now, within those issues, over the years, you can see trends shift. So there was a big focus on marine protected areas. Uh, then the world kind of shifted to plastic, and now it's more focused on climate change within our world. So the funding opportunities will change over time. But other issues in our ocean conservation world, like fisheries or marine mammal protection, are things that are fundable,
Right.
but we've shied away from them. So I think there isn't any real answer. There wasn't any magic trick other than being, hey, these are our five issues. We know that that's already too much, probably, and so focus is key. And so we've been pretty intentional, and we've walked away from a lot of funding opportunities because they were off mission, or funders who say, "Hey, I really want to fund a K through 12 education program. That's where the future is." And we're like, "Hey, that's not our core competency. Like we do education broadly, but we're really about grassroots stewardship and advocacy." And so, yeah, I guess part of it's like knowing who you are and what your strengths are and being determined to stick to them.
That's amazing. That comment right there is so important for leaders to hear, and probably board members too, to uh, have that understanding that it's okay to focus. It's okay to walk away from some things because it's not part of the core competency, and because it can take your focus away from your core mission. So thank you
Oh,
for
and,
sharing that.
and even just to double down on that, I would argue that at least it's worked out for us this way, is we've actually raised more money by focusing than by diversifying.
Okay.
And I think that's because we have more impact, which is at the end of the day what people want to fund. They want their dollar to go a long way. And our fundraising team isn't running around with their head cut off just looking for opportunities. They can be targeted and focused because they need to point their energy where it's going to have the maximum benefit. So I
Yeah.
feel like the more focused we are, it may seem counterintuitive, but the more success we're having fundraising.
Yeah. No, it makes sense to me. And it might have also something to do with the fact that you are the leader in those areas. You're not diluting your efficacy by trying to do so many different things. You are really the policy expert, the subject matter expert on a lot of these issues, and the one that's actually in the water making things different and better. So
Yeah.
that's
Well, I mean, you and I spoke about this in the past, but it's very common for people who are very successful in other fields who become donors to your organization to be convinced they have all the answers because they built some successful tech company or some ad firm or you name it, which I'm sure they're an expert in their field, but
right,
they often come in and think that because you're a nonprofit, they can tell you what to do.
right.
Um, and I think as a leader and as a fundraiser in the nonprofit world, that can be quite challenging. Um, but I do think if you stick to your guns, you know, it's tempting to let those influences influence you because there may be money attached to them, but I think it's a mistake.
Yeah, no, it's so good. We could do a whole nother podcast on how to manage the genius that exists on a board, who are largely a group of extraordinarily successful, wealthy people, where there is often this assumption that, because there's a lot of money, there must be a lot of intelligence attached
Yeah,
to it. And not to say that they aren't incredibly intelligent, but there's a huge difference between running an organization that sells widgets to a consumer base and an organization that's attempting to keep an ocean clean, that doesn't sell anything to a consumer, except
that's right.
that.
A lot of for-profit folks think it's easy to fundraise for nonprofits, and uh, it's not. They usually find that it's not because it's a lot easier to sell something when you're going to sell an 8% return on your dollar versus an 8% return on your impact.
Yeah, 100%. And it's so fascinating too because a lot of for-profit companies have a single revenue model that is what keeps them alive and profitable. And when you think about an organization like Surfrider Foundation, I'm sure over the years there's been corporate money, individual money, foundation money, government money at all different levels, estate gifts. There's been just and then there's organizations, and I'm not sure if Surfrider's ever been in this, where there's actually been earned income from sales of products, which is fascinating as well, right? And potentially ownership of certain businesses that spin off revenue to support a nonprofit. So it's way more complicated than people can even imagine coming from the for-profit world.
Yeah, and then in fact, the development director who preceded the guy who's here currently, a guy named Steve Blank, was our previous development director. To his credit, kind of post 2008, he really helped us diversify our revenue streams at Surfrider. So we're not quite, but like roughly equally, like major gifts, membership, corporate partnerships, grants, and a handful of other things that are kind of another bucket. They're almost like 20% a piece. It's not quite that perfect, but that has made us very resilient because they're all affected by different things at different times in the financial ecosystem.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, we have five revenue streams, if not 15.
It's amazing. And shame on me for not even bringing forward membership uh, for a membership organization, right? Which is another one of those revenue streams. And I'm proud to be a dues-paying member of the
Thank
Surfrider
you.
Foundation. Yeah, and have been for a couple of years. And I love it. So I think it just goes to the idea that scalability, to bring it back to the topic at hand, benefits from being resilient, benefits from being diversified in terms of your
Yes.
revenue. I certainly can remember organizations like Junior Achievement when the Great Recession hit. The organization just sort of fell off a cliff because the corporate money that they relied on almost at 100% levels dried up, right? And so
Yep. And we're seeing that now with organizations that rely on federal funding almost exclusively.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
so, yeah. So, yeah, back to your question, we have had what I would argue is steady compounded growth. So, growing at 10 to 15 to 20% a year, but then doing it year over year. So, we tripled in size by steadily growing.
Yeah.
It wasn't any single home run.
Well, let's talk about keeping the culture together, keeping it positive, managing a team when you're growing so fast. How did you manage that onboarding and culture building at scale?
You know, that has been without question challenges.
Yep.
Uh, I remember one of our early one of the funders who kind of came in, it was a .com, a B2B .com was became a Surfrider funder founded by surfers, and they were like rapidly growing like .coms tend to do, tech companies tend to do. And this guy was one of these founders who had founded maybe 5 or 6 tech companies. He had had a lot of success, and this was early in my tenure, and Surfrider at the time was about 35 employees. And he said, "Hey, he's like the hardest time period for any organization is between 50 and 100 people
Okay.
because you kind of shift from being informal to formal, going from informal processes to formal processes."
Right.
And it really stuck with me because we were still living in a time where, like, at 35, you could get away with a lot of informal processes,
Mm.
communication, requests, prioritization, all these things. And as we grew, now we're at 85, so we're at the other end of that spectrum. We've really had to formalize a lot of the processes. Um, Internal newsletter, communication channels, and so form request forms for graphics from the marketing department.
Right.
So like a lot of stuff like there's a metaphor going from the pirates to the Navy. And so, we kind of, and I have to say, I gave it's talking about sort of looking ahead. So about 4 years ago, we do an annual all staff summit, and I give the keynote about where we're at, state of Surfrider, where we're headed, and I had listened to a podcast from a guy named Dara Khosrowshahi. He's the current CEO of Uber.
Okay.
He was at Expedia before that. One of America's top executives. He also happened to be like a college friend of mine.
Oh,
Um, and he gave an interview on Reid Hoffman's How I Made This, or no, Built to Scale, his podcast, and he used this pirates in the Navy metaphor for Uber. So I used that at Surfrider because we were kind of going through this. Well, it went over like a lead balloon.
no.
My staff hated it. Pirates forever. And
Oh,
it was a total fail on my part. I thought. I was like, man, that did not work. And
interesting.
what's really interesting, well, fast forward to like last year, and the pirates are like, hey, we really aren't getting a lot of information from Surfrider. We really need standardized information platforms and communications. And all of a sudden, they all started asking me for structure. Um, they wanted the Navy.
Yeah.
They just didn't they like self-identifying as pirates, but so I was just actually ahead of the curve. I
Yeah.
saw what was coming. They hadn't seen that yet, and they eventually came around to it.
Yeah.
Um, I
So even
think I think the metaphor was like maybe ill-picked because they liked the being the rebels,
right, right, of
and
course.
they didn't like maybe the military analogy, but anyway, so we've had to build a lot of that structure, and a lot of it's psychological too. Back to this story, some people got it and understood, and other people, wanted us to be this homey 30 person organization that could get away with the informal structure. So not everyone came along for the ride.
Yeah, understood.
As a result, we had to let people go who couldn't adapt to the new system, and what I'm trying to explain to people, and then, well, get back to your soul question, is like, in my mind, we're formalizing the boring stuff, email platforms, rules, procedures, so that we can free up our time to be creative about the campaigns that we run and how we innovate at the chapter levels, because otherwise those other things become time sucks. So my idea is like build structure around the things that need structure and allow freedom around the creative sides of the organization. And I see those as being complementary.
Yeah. And if you commit to growth, which translates to impact, if it's the requirement of the organization and the vision and mission of the organization to grow that impact, you're going to have to surround yourself with people who are willing to be a part of that, right? I mean, you just can't afford to have the drag of people that want to maintain a certain level of more limited impact, even though it's still good work. It's just not where the organization needs to go and the work that the organization needs to do to help save the planet, right? I mean, there's too much at stake for Surfrider to remain small.
That's right. And I mean, the issues we're contending with, plastic pollution is a global issue, climate change is a global issue. So they're much larger than we could ever be as an organization. But I actually talk about that a lot because, um, it's tough to let people go or to make tough decisions that aren't popular. And my COO and I, who work very close together, we're like a way to depersonalize that is we're stewards of this mission statement
Mhm.
and this organization and the mission. We owe it to the mission and the importance of the work to make the tough decisions that we believe will advance the mission. Um, because like you said, the mission, the goals are much bigger than we are, and we're trying to grow to even have more, to take a bigger chunk out of them. But I try to remind myself that like that's my ultimate responsibility, is to be the steward, or 41-year-old organization, is to do what's best for that mission statement, is really at the end of the day my real obligation.
Well, I got goosebumps when you made that statement, so it clearly means something to me, that idea. I think it's just so powerful and so important, you as the steward of this mission.
And it gives you it allows you to depersonalize things a little bit, because it's hard, especially when it comes to staff decisions, because those are tough.
Right, right, 100%. Well, and I could see that maybe that was a major way you evolved as a leader with this growth that you were seeing, experiencing, and driving, and wanted to see more of. But I'm wondering if there were other habits or mindsets or skills that became essential and continue to be essential for you as you are on this scaling journey.
Well, yeah, there is. And one of the other things that was a profound for us, is one of my mentors, to sort of tie some of these things together, who leads a large international ad firm. He's now on our board of directors. You know, I was talking to him about my challenges and what was going on at Surfrider before he came on our board. And he said he had an executive coach. He's running a multi-hundred-million-dollar global for-profit ad firm, and he had an executive coach. And he said, you should think about, he's like, it's been the best thing for me. You should think about getting a coach. So I talked to his coach, who referred me to someone who was a nonprofit coach. And I hired this woman, and for a year, maybe a year and a half, I worked with her sort of exclusively. And what that taught me, which was really profound, is I was busy doing, arguably. I was kind of intuitively focused on leadership, what I thought of as leadership, but I wasn't taking a step back and thinking about leadership itself. It's almost like a meta thing.
Okay.
Like, how am I showing up as a leadership? What does leadership mean to me? What does it mean to our team? We were having our weekly leadership meeting, and we were talking about all the work, but we weren't talking about being leaders. So this idea of taking a step back and focusing on leadership as its own skill set was pretty profound. And then because we were growing, my sort of leadership team, the heads of all the departments, their teams were growing really rapidly. So I realized it wasn't just me who needed the leadership training, it was my leadership team.
Right.
So I expanded the coaching from myself to our team. So we spent 2 years working with this leadership coach as a group, um, to because I realized like, hey, I need this, but so does everybody else. Because you know, we typically take experts and turn them into leaders, and we expect their skills, like they could be a climate scientist, now they're running the climate team, and they may be very well versed in the science, but maybe not versed in leadership. And so I wanted part of that like success of scaling was making sure that everyone on the leadership team had the leadership skills necessary to grow, to manage
Yeah,
departments that were now 10,
brilliant.
15 people.
Yeah, no, it's brilliant. What went through my mind was that leadership is not an infectious disease. You don't if someone has great leadership, it doesn't mean that everything that they know, all the skills that they possess, just automatically are imbued in these other people. That's not how it works, right? And so you kind of figured out like, oh, wow, some of the same things I've learned, I need to either teach or make available as education to these other leaders who are running and leading in important ways.
Yeah, and I think and leadership's a science. It's art and science, but I think most people, myself included, had natural leadership schools or intuitively sort of found their way. And that's why you kind of advance in your career, ultimately up to maybe, getting the CEO job itself. But I had no formal training. Um, and so like this idea that leadership is a science, and there's books, there's an infinite amount of information out there. So you can sort of read up, which I certainly did, but like we actually turned it into sort of a practice inside the building.
It's great. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it'll continue to be important because you're venturing into territory that you've never been, even still, right? So it
Yeah.
like for you and for so many organizations, they've never been $100 million a year organization. They've never been $1 billion a year organization.
Right.
And
I mean,
that's where you're going. So
yeah.
you gotta learn
Yeah.
how to do it.
That's right. And that's part of that's part of the thrill of the job is it's constantly evolving and changing, and I'm having to learn and adapt, and that's what's certainly keeping me on my toes and keeping it interesting.
Yeah, no, I love it. Well, I want to provide an opportunity for you to give some advice to fellow leaders. I feel like the whole conversation has actually been good advice for leaders that are in the process of scaling or want to scale or trying to avoid any pitfalls. So, what advice would you offer to other nonprofit CEOs and other leaders too, who are probably going to step into some of these leadership roles in the future? About scaling well and scaling responsibly.
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's interesting. Like, I think like there's this balance between sort of optimism and realism, and I tend to sort of be this sort of maybe overly optimistic, let's go. I balance that. Like some of the folks on my leadership team are a little bit more cautious, and I think there's a real good yin yang there. So I'm not trying to grow us too fast, and they're grounding us in reality. So like vision without execution doesn't really get you anywhere. And so I think that's for me been really good to sort of complement those two. You know, I think that's been good. I think one of the guys that I mentioned, he was like, there are no quick wins. Um, you want to build incrementally, and I think that's been served us well too, because I have seen groups get a giant windfall, uh, greatly expand their staff. It's almost like what VCs do to companies.
Yeah.
And then they have this like 3-year runway to try to like build to their new capacity. And then they fall off a cliff, and then they're laying off half the people they hired. And then they go into a sort of profound era of disenfranchisement and dysfunction because like everyone just went, they went through this crazy cycle.
Right.
And so trying to avoid that and have slow and steady growth, I think is pretty fundamental.
Yeah. No, I like that. That's great
If
advice.
we did get a windfall, we'd sock it away.
Right, right. I'm sure you'd be very measured and strategic about
Exactly.
how you'd put it to get you. So I mean, I've seen plenty of organizations who get that $1 to $5 million gift, let's say, and there are no strings attached, and the organization uses it to scale up, which is great, more impact, and then sort of never has the plan in place for how they're going to sustain that level of support once the funds from that windfall expire, right? And it's just too common. And so that's a good cautionary tale for folks. Is there anything that you'd whisper to yourself in hindsight if you could go back and say, hey, maybe next time, make sure you pay attention to this?
You know, I I think um change is harder than people think, and to be patient with yourself. I think I expected results to come more quickly than they did. And,
Yeah.
some of that impatience is healthy because you push, and some of it's unhealthy because you sort of have unrealistic expectations about what's possible. So now I try to think of things in like sort of 3-year increments instead of 12-month increments. And I find myself like, and it feels so long and then you blink and it's gone.
Yeah.
Um, we did a huge tech overhaul 3 years ago, to adapt to the growth that we're seeing, and 12 months into it, like, we were expecting miracles and we were in the middle of the pain of the transition still, and now 3 years later, we're reaping all the benefits. And 2 years ago, I heard this is a disaster. Why are we doing this? This sucks. I never want to do this again. And now that pain has been forgotten, and people are like, "This is amazing. This stuff's working so well. Look what's happening." And
Right. And it was so easy.
had I set it wouldn't have shortened the pain, but if I had set the expectations differently in the beginning, this isn't a 10K, this is a marathon.
Yeah, that's what I
Uh,
was.
that
This is a lot
that
of
would have
stuff.
been, yeah, that would have been probably better for everyone.
Yeah, and it's interesting because let's say it's a marathon, right? And Surfrider's in mile three. Like this is
Yeah.
26.2 miles where maybe the hardest part of the race or the last couple of miles, maybe even the last mile. Yeah. And so if you're mile three, there's a lot of road ahead for Surfrider Foundation. And I'm wondering for you, like, what does that future look like? Are there new frontiers of impact or influence you're aiming to reach? What's your vision look like for the rest of the race, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of, I would say it's broken into a couple parts. We didn't talk about directly, but I got to know you because we launched a big 5-year fundraising campaign. We're about a third of the way through the goal and about halfway through the time. And that was to kind of get us from being a $15 million organization basically up to like a 25 million dollar organization. That's kind of the size we think we need to like effectively run our grassroots operation across the country.
Interesting. Got
Um,
it.
I imagine when we're there, we'll think it needs to be bigger than that. It's always the case.
Yeah.
But so that's kind of like the 3 to 5 year time horizon is kind of continuing that trajectory. And that's really for us, like our sort of like meta goal is to be agenda setters at the federal level. So
Love
the
it.
idea is to, be able to have like, let's get rid of single-use plastics, a scourge on society, and like we're chipping away at that at the local and state level. And we want this, so we want to be agenda setters at the national level. And then the biggest issue that we're all facing, if you love our coast and ocean, is climate change. We've got, between 2 feet and 6 feet of sea level rise coming at us. It's going to have a profound impact on every coastal community in the country and the world. island nations like Tuvalu have already bought property in Fiji with the plan to move their entire country. And so, that's the big 600-pound gorilla is adapting to that. And we're just at the beginnings of it. I think Surfrider has a profound opportunity and responsibility to help lead that transition as a group that's in coastal communities and it's got the science and the know-how. So that's kind of that's the big issue that's come into our future. And we've got some good projects that in San Onofre and at Surfers Point in Ventura that are demonstration projects of what we're going to need to do.
Yeah.
So.
I'm looking forward to seeing you out at Sano. I'm looking forward to seeing the future of Surfrider Foundation and all that you're going to be able to accomplish. You're doing such important work, and I'm wishing you all the best. And so are millions of other people who care about our oceans. So thank you, Chad, for sharing your expertise and wisdom with us today. It's been an amazing conversation. There's so much to unpack here. I know the audience is going to benefit so significantly from all the advice that you've given, whether the organization that the audience is leading is scaling or not. You really gave some important recommendations and ideas around just how to be a stronger leader and stay on mission and grow the impact of the organization. So thank you for doing that. And unfortunately for me, it brings us to the end of our podcast episode today. Wanted to thank you, Chad, for all of the contributions here, and an encouragement to the audience to please subscribe to this podcast, Lead for Good, but also our Mastering Fundraising podcast and the Nonprofit Edge podcast. All of them focus on interviews with extraordinary individuals who are making deep impacts in the nonprofit sector as leaders. But until next time, wishing you all the best and encouraging you all to do what you can for this world by leading for good. Thanks all.
Thank you for joining us for this most recent episode of Lead for Good. Our passion is helping nonprofit leaders reach their full potential as leaders, and we sincerely hope this episode has been edifying for you. Please subscribe to this podcast to not miss any of our Lead for Good conversations. We welcome your feedback, suggestions, and comments via email at hello@fulcrumleader.com. Lead for Good is a production of Fulcrum Nonprofit Leadership. Please visit us on the web at www.fulcrumleader.com. Until next time, we wish you all the best and encourage you to always lead for good. Welcome to Lead for Good, a podcast for nonprofit leaders of all titles and all experience levels. This is a show where the audience will meet and get to know top nonprofit leaders. Together, we will take a deep dive into nonprofit leadership, endeavoring to uncover and unpack the most important characteristics, traits, strategies, and actions of successful nonprofit leaders. Through this journey together, we desire to help you, the nonprofit leader, grow your knowledge and capabilities to lead for good. We want you to achieve your full potential as leaders in the sector. So, welcome to the conversation. We're glad you joined us today. Without further delay, let's join our host, Chris Looney, as he interviews yet another extraordinary leader who is truly leading for good. Enjoy the show.